Commerce Alive Today presents
Pacific Southwest Airlines. PSA started as an offshoot of San Diego-based Friedkin Aeronautics. The flight school Kenny Friedkin started to train returning GIs. When GI business dried up, on May 6, 1949, Friedkin started flying once a week from San Diego to Oakland via Burbank with a $1,000 a month leased Douglas DC-3. Friedkin obtained information from a travel agent upon starting the airline due to lessons learned from a failed precursor airline, Friedkin Airlines. Reservations were initially taken at a World War II surplus latrine refitted as a ticket office. The original fare from Burbank to Oakland was $9.99. In July 1951, PSA added a flight to San Francisco. Oakland was dropped in 1954, but restored to the system in 1965. DC-3s went in and out of the fleet, but the total number was never more than 4. PSA was one of 8 California intrastate carriers that started flying in the 13-month period from January 1949 through January 1950, but only California Central Airlines and PSA lasted longer than a year. CCA started in January 1949 and through its demise in February 1955 was larger, and flew better equipment than PSA. But CCA was not as focused as PSA, which stuck just to the San Diego to Bay Area route and ultimately went bankrupt. PSA bid on CCA in the bankruptcy auction, but lost to a group composed of Allegheny Airlines and Southwest Airways, no relation to today's Southwest Airlines, which shut CCA immediately, leaving PSA as the only intrastate competitor. In 1955, 4 Douglas DC-4s replaced the DC-3s, with PSA painting rectangles around the windows to make them resemble the more modern Douglas DC-6. In January 1958, PSA scheduled 37 DC-4s a week Burbank to San Francisco, 29 of which originated in San Diego and 4 nonstop San Diego to San Francisco. United Airlines, Western Airlines and TWA then scheduled a total of 241 nonstop flights each week from Los Angeles to San Francisco, plus 49 flights a week from Burbank to San Francisco. About half of these flights by the competition were first class, only $22.05. The rest carried coach passengers for $13.50, all fares subject to then 5% federal excise tax. In July 1958, PSA shifted some flights from Burbank to Los Angeles International Airport. That year it carried 296,000 passengers. In late 1959, PSA began flying Lockheed Electra turboprops with 92 seats and a 6-seat lounge, replacing 70-seat DC-4s. In 1963, PSA got its 6th Electra. By then it carried more passengers between the Bay Area and Los Angeles than any other airline. Total PSA passengers climbed from 355,000 in 1959 to 1,305,000 in 1963 and 5,162,000 in 1970. On March 16, 1962, founder Kenny Friedkin, only 47 years old, died of a cerebral hemorrhage. He had lived to see his airline become a success, but it was still tiny, with only 5 aircraft. J. Floyd Andrews, one of Friedkin's fellow founders, took over. Andrews's era was tumultuous, PSA achieving a high national profile. This was the era of hot pant-clad flight attendants on pink liveried aircraft, a classic image of California in the late 1960s and early 1970s. As discussed below, PSA became utterly dominant in the intra-California market, but also overreached to the point it almost went bankrupt. Less than a year later, PSA went public, with a February 14, 1963, initial public offering, 313,000 shares, 100,000 of them primary at $19. Preparations had been underway for some time. PSA had an unusual corporate structure, with its aircraft owned through 3 companies owned by founders. In January 1962, these were merged into PSA. Prospectus facts that caught the eye of one observer included: with only 5 98-seat Electras, PSA nonetheless had the second highest passenger market share in San Francisco, and the 5th largest in Los Angeles. Speedy 20-minute aircraft turnarounds and no-frills service. 9 months profit to September 30, 1962, of over $1 million at a time when the Los Angeles to San Francisco fare was just $13.50. 937,000 passengers carried between San Francisco and Los Angeles in 11 months ending November 30, 1962, compared to 642,000 in the same period the prior year. Until 1965, as an intrastate airline, PSA had a free hand in terms of how and where it flew within California. The California Public Utilities Commission was limited to regulating PSA's prices. So long as PSA stayed within the boundaries of an intrastate airline, the Federal Civil Aeronautics Board, which otherwise tightly regulated U.S. airlines, had no say, though as with any U.S. airline, the Federal Aviation Administration operationally regulated PSA. As of September 17, 1965, the CPIC had new powers over California Intrastate Airlines of Economic Certification. PSA was grandfathered route entry/exit and service quality. PSA was in favor of this. In the early 1960s, a number of new entrant California intrastate carriers had come and gone, the most notorious being Paradise Airlines, which had a terrible accident in 1964. PSA believed it would benefit from market stability, but observers predicted that over time the CPIC would become just as restrictive as the CAB, which, in fact, happened. From 1965 through U.S. airline deregulation in 1978, the CPIC certified only two intrastate airlines, Air California and Holiday Airlines. From September 17, 1965, through 1978, PSA had to apply to the CPIC for all new routes, generally in competition with Air California. Despite having total network freedom, PSA evolved its network minimally from 1949 to 1965. It served only 5 airports: San Diego, LAX Burbank, San Francisco, and Oakland. In 1965, Orange County Airport, later John Wayne Airport, had a new runway. It approached PSA about serving it, and like the others, PSA demurred. This was a mistake. The CPIC certificated Air California to bring intrastate air service to Orange County, and the airport became a big deal. The county was the fastest growing in the nation in the 1960s, population increasing from 700,000 in 1960 to 1.4 millimeters in 1970. There was a lot of demand for Orange County service. Having certificated Air California, the CPIC was open about its desire that Air California survive, so it kept PSA out of Orange County, gave other desirable routes to Air California, and otherwise took steps to protect it. The CPIC assigned routes to PSA or Air California, but rarely both. Despite a rocky first 5 years, Air California survived and the CPIC ensured minimal competition between it and PSA. PSA tried to buy Air California twice. In December 1969, an ailing Air California agreed to a merger, but the CPIC was slow to approve. In May 1970, PSA withdrew, citing the slow CPIC, and almost immediately thereafter, San Diego tycoon C. Arnold Smith took control of Air California through his Westgate California Corporation. In mid-1972, PSA agreed to buy WCC's majority stake in Air California. Against heavy opposition, the CPIC agreed to the merger when WCC said it would no longer fund Air California losses. However, the U.S. Department of Justice sued to prevent the merger, noting PSA had a 70% intra-California market share and Air California had an 11% share. By now a year had passed. PSA withdrew from the merger after Air California auditors withdrew certification of 1971 and 1972 financial statements, one of the first steps in a scandal that enveloped C. Arnold Smith, including the 1973 seizure of his bank, the largest in San Diego, and the 1974 bankruptcy of WCC. PSA's fleet changed constantly in the 1960s and 1970s. The 1960s started with Electras, then Boeing 727-100s arrived in 1965, PSA's first pure jet. The last Electra flight was September 1968. By 1969, PSA was swapping out 727-100s and replacing them with bigger 727-200s plus 737-200s. At the beginning of 1970, the fleet comprised one 727-100, 16 727-200s and 9 737s. In the late 1960s, PSA also briefly had DC-9s. The justification was to train pilots of other airlines. As discussed below, the L-1011s made a brief appearance in 1974 to 1975, but by then PSA was shedding the 737s, the last left in the fleet in 1976. In 1975, Lockheed Electras returned to support flights to Tahoe. Other than the Electras required to operate to Tahoe, PSA settled on 727s in the late 1970s, acquiring used 727-100s as well as additional new 727-200s. PSA entered Tahoe after Holiday Airlines collapsed. Holiday basically served nowhere other than Tahoe, a choice that sealed its fate. PSA applied to the CPIC for Holiday's routes in 1974. Holiday said it couldn't afford to defend itself in front of the CPIC and went out of business in February 1975. The CPIC split the Tahoe routes between Air California and PSA on an emergency basis, but required the two carriers use Electras for Tahoe. One of PSA's first actions of the deregulated era, which started January 1, 1979, was to exit Tahoe, citing the high cost of Electras in a fleet that otherwise comprised 31 727s. An early indication that, for J. Floyd Andrews, PSA was not enough came in December 1968 with an audacious bid for Western Airlines, then under attack by Kirk Kerkorian. Western was 4 times the revenue of PSA, and as an interstate carrier, regulated by the CAB. It was unclear how this would work, putting together two airlines with different regulators, whether CAB approval would be forthcoming. PSA pulled the bid in April 1969, citing deteriorating Western results. By that time, Kerkorian was, while not a majority owner of Western, difficult to dislodge, controlling 9 out of 21 seats on the board. As outlined in a section below, PSA instead pursued a non-airline acquisition strategy. Southwest Airlines was founded in 1967, but grueling legal challenges caused its operational start to be delayed until June 1971. Founder Roland King took inspiration from PSA. Founding President Lamar Muse was open about the debt to PSA, saying, "We don't mind being copycats of an operation like that, including hot pants." PSA hosted King and Muse for a 4-day visit in 1971 and gave them a copy of PSA's FAA operating manuals, from which Southwest created its own in what Muse said was primarily a copy-and-paste procedure. PSA helping Southwest made sense in 1971, with each airline strictly limited to flying within its state and seemingly no prospect of that ever changing. Mutual admiration was expressed monetarily. In 1978, Southwest management and directors owned 6% of PSA, while PSA directors and management owned 10% of Southwest. In July 1968, PSA bought rental car company Valcar, a former Hertz subsidiary with a West Coast presence. Like PSA, Valcar had a budget orientation, but PSA couldn't make it work and shut it down in 1971, after failing to sell it. On January 15, 1969, while it was climbing to its cruising altitude, PSA Flight 990, a Boeing 727-100 registered as N973PS, collided with a Cessna 182 registered as N42242 at around what the Cessna 182's pilot, Richard A. Bridgeford, believes was 1,800 feet. Both aircraft were in controlled airspace on the same frequency. The 727 continued on to Ontario, California and made a safe landing. The Cessna lost its right wingtip and 3/4 of its right aileron, so Bridgeford decided return to San Francisco. He also decided to cut his engine and managed to glide to San Francisco International Airport without any further incident. A passenger on board the Boeing 727 reported that he had seen a light plane fly very close to the aircraft. UPI reported that a PSA spokesman said that a nacelle on one of the engines in the bottom tip of the tail were slightly damaged. In April 1969, PSA bought the San Franciscan Hotel in downtown San Francisco. In June, PSA bought the Islandia in San Diego's Mission Bay. In June 1971, PSA committed to a to-be-constructed hotel at the Los Angeles Hollywood Park racetrack, now the site of SoFi Stadium, and in December 1971, committed to a to-be-constructed hotel within the Queen Mary attraction in Long Beach. The synergies were not obvious. None of the hotels were located at airports, none of them were value-oriented. In 1973, CEO Andrews called the hotels a complete flop and in 1974 gave 3 of them to Hyatt to run. It took years for PSA to extricate itself. In 1979, PSA finally sold the San Franciscan but had yet to sell the Queen Mary Hotel. In August 1970, PSA started buying radio stations. By 1975, its 4 stations were for sale. PSA also bought a catamaran. In 1973, PSA created a holding company, PSA Incorporated, for the airline and many non-airline subsidiaries. In late summer 1970, PSA ordered 5 Lockheed L-1011 wide-body aircraft, deliveries starting 1972. In the next 12 months, the L-1011 engine maker, Rolls-Royce, went bankrupt, and Lockheed required a U.S. government bailout to avoid the same. In December 1971, PSA canceled the order, but Lockheed said it couldn't. In September 1972, PSA signed a new order, deliveries starting 1974. PSA grounded its 2 L-1011s after 8 months. A 300-seat aircraft never made sense in a business model that depended on quick aircraft turnarounds. Economics presented to the CPIC showed L-1011 per seat cost no better than a 727 despite being twice as large. PSA refused the last 3 aircraft and was stuck paying a 15-year lease on the first 2. It entered into years of litigation with Lockheed. On January 7, 1972, PSA Flight 902, a Boeing 727-200 flight from San Francisco to Los Angeles, was hijacked to Cuba. The captain negotiated the release of the passengers in Los Angeles, and the hijackers, who had with them a baby and were armed with a shotgun and other arms, proceeded to Cuba, with a fueling stop in Tampa. 3 flight attendants and 3 off-duty flight attendants accompanied the flight to Cuba. On July 5, 1972, PSA Flight 710, a Boeing 737-200 flight from Sacramento to San Francisco, was hijacked with demands to fly to the Soviet Union. The plane was stormed while on the ground at San Francisco, resulting in the deaths of 1 passenger and the 2 hijackers. One of the passengers, who survived being shot in the back, was the actor Victor Sen Young, best known as Hop Sing from the Bonanza television series. 1 other passenger was shot and survived. On March 5, 1974, a PSA Nank YS-11 training aircraft's engines failed, resulting in the aircraft crashing in the desert near Borrego Springs, California. The turboprop aircraft was doing a simulated landing stall. All of the 4 crew members survived the crash. The aircraft was written off. By 1975, losses from diversification in L-1011s brought PSA to the brink of bankruptcy. Operating losses on rental cars, radio stations and hotels through 1974, not including cost of acquisition, were almost $9 million. Through 1977, PSA lost another $1 million on discontinued businesses and recognized $18 in L-1011 losses. In 1982, PSA took another $4.2 million loss against its 2 L-1011s, still unable to find a home for them. PSA's troubles attracted national attention. PSA went to the CPIC asking for a fair increase to bail them out. The CPIC excoriated PSA, questioning management competency at length and especially withering about a 1974 $8 share buyback. In March 1976, J. Floyd Andrews gave up the CEO position, and in May, resigned as chair of the board. As airline deregulation was being debated, for most of the country, it promised lower prices. But California already had lower prices, set by the CPIC. By comparison, in Texas, Southwest Airlines set its own fares. The Texas Aeronautics Commission didn't get involved. The concern and expectation was deregulation would lead to higher prices. California legislators and Governor Jerry Brown wanted the CPIC to remain in charge of any airline that did over 50% of its business in California. This amendment was voted down in the relevant U.S. House of Representatives subcommittee by 1 vote. Instead, deregulation as passed included strong federal preemption. States had little say over an airline with a federal certificate. By then, the CPIC had become the restrictive bureaucracy observers had predicted when it was given additional powers in 1965, second-guessing everything California intrastate carriers did, and even itself, as exemplified in the role the CPIC played in the 1975 demise of Holiday Airlines. PSA also played a special role at the CPIC. It was assumed to be the most efficient carrier, therefore CPIC fares were set relative to what would make the highest permissible profit for PSA. All other carriers operating in California then had to toe that line. So PSA had ample reason to regret its support of that 1965 legislation. However, under the Airline Deregulation Act, the minute PSA started flying to Nevada in December 1978, it was free of the CPIC. The CPIC didn't take that lying down. The CPIC sued in federal court to overturn the Airline Deregulation Act, lost, appealed, and lost again. On September 25, 1978, PSA Flight 182, a Boeing 727-200, crashed in San Diego while trying to land at Lindbergh Field, California, after colliding with a Cessna 172. All 135 aboard the PSA flight were killed, as were the 2 in the Cessna and 7 on the ground. At the time, it was the deadliest plane crash in U.S. airspace. It remains the worst mid-air collision in the United States. A lawsuit argued by Gary Aguirre resulted in a verdict against PSA for damages. The fact that San Diego was the company's hometown. The culpability of the flight crew. It was responsible for keeping track of the small aircraft, but lost focus. 1978 wasn't through with PSA yet. At the end of 1978 it transpired corporate raider Harold Simmons had accumulated a 20% stake. When PSA, appealing to investors, referred to a 30-year history of success, Simmons printed ads summarizing PSA's far from successful 1970s financials and noting 1977 profits were about half those of 1971, despite revenues almost twice as large. But as PSA said, Andrews was gone. Simmons evinced no desire to destroy PSA, seeing it instead as a takeover candidate from which he could profit. PSA won a shareholder vote to implement takeover defenses with just a bit more than 50%, but the company had postdated the shareholder record date to ensure Simmons couldn't vote his whole stake. Simmons said he'd sue. In the end, PSA paid him off by giving him some aircraft in exchange for his stake. To be fair, notwithstanding Flight 182, PSA's 1978 financials were somewhat better, but significantly flattered by an accounting change. As PSA headed towards deregulation, both the airline and Wall Street thought it would be a winner. But in December 1978, Paul Barkley, then PSA's chief operating officer later CEO, spoke about the deregulated future a few weeks away. He expected something fairly sedate, quite different from the bitter Darwinistic struggle that would engulf the industry. Discounted airfares would fade away due to a shortage of aircraft and passenger capacity. Another factor against discount airfares was that they were too hard to administer. Capacity would be tight through the mid-1980s due to lack of aircraft. The airline industry would be healthier in deregulation, there would be no revolutionary changes. Competition would not be intense, again, due to lack of aircraft. Dallas-Fort Worth-based Braniff International Airways was the first trunk carrier to fail after deregulation. U.S. trunk airlines were the descendants of the original 16 airlines certified by the CAB and thereafter regulated to be the main U.S. carriers. Braniff had been successful just prior to deregulation, but Harding Lawrence, Braniff's imperious longtime leader, expanded the carrier excessively immediately after deregulation, resulting in its May 1982 bankruptcy and shutdown. Until Continental did so in 1983, no one knew an airline could recover from Chapter 11 bankruptcy. In October 1982, PSA announced a cheap and low-risk deal to expand into a new geography. Under an 8-year contract, Braniff would fly 25 to 3,727s from its Texas base with PSA colors and marketing, employing 1,500 Braniff employees who would have to agree to lower wages and higher productivity as well as gates and takeoff/landing slots. These slots were key Braniff assets. In the wake of the August 1981 air traffic controller strike, the FAA had limited air traffic control capacity, so allocated each airline takeoff/landing slots at specific airports. When Braniff collapsed, those rights were temporarily allocated to others. If Braniff flew again, it could recover those rights, grounding some operations at other carriers. It was a strong competitive lever. The initial deal failed when Braniff pilots refused to agree to lower seniority than PSA pilots in the event PSA ever merged with the PSA Braniff operation to ensure PSA pilots always got first pick of flying. Pride as well as pay was in play. PSA was perceived as junior league relative to Braniff. A new deal with Braniff simply equipped a new carrier with Braniff equipment to fly under contract to PSA, sidestepping Braniff's unions. Braniff would even loan PSA the funds. Further, the FAA noted if Braniff resumed flying it was entitled to its takeoff/landing slots, but a new airline that just happened to use Braniff assets was not. The deal died in March 1983. A second iteration of Braniff did start flying in 1984 without PSA help, ultimately without success, possible due to Texas already being home to Southwest which, expanding westward, had already entered PSA's home city of San Diego in January 1982, American Airlines which viewed Dallas-Fort Worth as its own, having moved its headquarters there in 1979 and Continental Airlines, which in 1983 would go through a bankruptcy that dramatically lowered its costs. Meanwhile, PSA was making money, but not by flying passengers. In 1982 and 1981 it sold aircraft and tax credits on aircraft to make a net profit while still producing an operating loss. In the years prior to deregulation, PSA said it must be ready for the day it was able to fly outside of California. When the day came, PSA management saw themselves as one of the natural beneficiaries of deregulation. But in fact, PSA did poorly. As the nearby table shows, AirCal's nominal growth from 1978 to 1985 was double that of PSA, Southwest was nearly triple. Perhaps most striking was the comparison of PSA with Piedmont Airlines, which per deregulation had been a local service airline regulated by the CAB. Piedmont was smaller than PSA in 1978 but well over twice its size in 1985. A July 1984 Los Angeles Times article noted PSA had been hanging fire since deregulation, management always waiting for some obstacle to clear. For instance, waiting to swap out the 727 fleet it had at deregulation, yet the abortive 1982-1983 Braniff deal would have doubled down on 727s, which were too large and too fuel inefficient given the rise in fuel prices, which PSA also blamed, and too labor-intensive given its three-person cockpit versus two places for the MD-80. 727s were a big factor in driving the company to ordering 20 Bay 146 aircraft in late 1983, which were both smaller and extremely quiet, an advantage in California where noise politics was a factor at airports like Orange County, Long Beach, and Burbank. PSA may have overcorrected. PSA ultimately configured Bay 146s with only 85 seats versus 150 for the MD-80s and 175s for the 727-200s. In one respect, PSA was lucky. The Bay 146 was eventually notorious for fairly significant engine problems that PSA management never had to deal with because it sold the Compa. A July 1984 Los Angeles Times article noted PSA had been hanging fire since deregulation, management always waiting for some obstacle to clear. For instance, waiting to swap out the 727 fleet it had at deregulation, yet the abortive 1982-1983 Braniff deal would have doubled down on 727s, which were too large and too fuel inefficient given the rise in fuel prices, which PSA also blamed, and too labor-intensive given its three-person cockpit versus two places for the MD-80. 727s were a big factor in driving the company to ordering 20 Bay 146 aircraft in late 1983, which were both smaller and extremely quiet, an advantage in California where noise politics was a factor at airports like Orange County, Long Beach, and Burbank. PSA may have overcorrected. PSA ultimately configured Bay 146s with only 85 seats versus 150 for the MD-80s and 175s for the 727-200s. In one respect, PSA was lucky. The Bay 146 was eventually notorious for fairly significant engine problems that PSA management never had to deal with because it sold the company before they became well known. As a stopgap, the airline also acquired 4 110-seat used DC-9s from Air Canada in 1983. PSA did not prioritize a single fleet type. But if looking for reasons for underperformance, management might have considered itself, since it was of long standing. William Shimp, CEO and chairman from 1976 to 1984, joined PSA in 1949. Paul Barkley, who succeeded Shimp, had been a C-suite officer at PSA since 1967. Notwithstanding the disastrous experience of the 1970s, management never lost its taste for diversification, diverting corporate attention from the airline. PSA Incorporated's 1983 annual report noted energy subsidiaries involved in fuel supply and distribution and oil and gas exploration and production, as well as aviation-related subsidiaries providing engine maintenance, aircraft leasing and flight training. In 1984, following another poor year in 1983, PSA asked for wage givebacks from airline employees. Employees would reduce pay by 15% in exchange for 15% of pre-tax airline profits and a 15% stake in the airline. Note, airline profits, not the holding company, PSA Incorporated, which included aircraft leasing and fuel distribution among other businesses. After some back and forth, employees went along with this in late 1984. Employees got to nominate 4 directors to the airline board. Famed retailer Sol Price of Price Club and FedMart was one such employee director. Another requirement was a separate publicly traded stock for the airline. On July 28, 1986, there was an initial public offering for the airline 1.8 mm shares at $7. Meanwhile, to eliminate confusion, the parent company which retained its own stock listing was renamed PS Group Incorporated. In the midst of this activity, the holding company continued to diversify. In September 1985, it added to its oil and gas investments. 1986 was the year of the airline merger. Republic into Northwest, Ozark into TWA, Western into Delta Airlines and others. In November, AirCal accepted an offer from American Airlines. On December 8, USAir announced an agreement to purchase PSA for $400. The combination had its skeptics. USAir's pre-PSA California presence was 12 flights per day to Pittsburgh and Indianapolis, so its brand awareness among Californians was minimal. The purchase closed May 29, 1987, but PSA and USAir pilot union chapters fought over transition agreements, delaying the merger of PSA into USAir beyond the original January 1, 1988, date. On December 7, 1987, PSA Flight 1771, a Bay 146, bound for San Francisco from Los Angeles, was airborne above the California Central Coast when it entered a high-speed nosedive and crashed near the town of Cayucos in San Luis Obispo County. Investigations determined that David Burke, a former USAir employee who had been fired for theft, armed himself and boarded the flight, which was carrying his former manager. After writing a note on an air sickness bag, Burke shot his ex-manager, a flight attendant, both pilots and the airline's chief pilot. Burke then pushed down on the control column, causing the aircraft to enter a dive. There were no survivors among the 38 passengers and 5 crew. The fact pattern of a USAir employee killing PSA crew and passengers overshadowed the last days of PSA. PSA finally merged into USAir on April 9, 1988. PS Group had long since banked what it was paid for its PSA, creating a well-funded life raft for select former PSA executives, among which Chairman Paul Barkley. By the time the merger was consummated, PS Group had used some of the PSA money to buy a stake in a travel agency business, to go along with its aircraft leasing and oil and gas interests. The successors of PSA and AirCal, USAir and American, raised prices, reflecting their higher costs. In early 1990, the last-minute round-trip fare from Los Angeles to Sacramento was $456, over $1,000 in 2024 dollars. State legislators were increasingly irate, finally proposing a raft of bills to punish the carriers, even suggesting a state-owned airline, but the market had already taken care of the problem. United Airlines had already announced an increase in frequency on Los Angeles to San Francisco from 16 to 27 per day, and Southwest Airlines had announced it was entering Burbank with 10-a-day service to Oakland at a last-minute fare of $59 one way, $29 in advance. The resulting Los Angeles Basin to San Francisco Bay fare war was brutal, made worse when Iraq invaded Kuwait, thereby spiking oil prices, collapsing demand for international travel and tipping the U.S. into the Gulf War. In January 1991, in announcements only 2 weeks apart, first American and then USAir gutted the former AirCal and PSA systems, throwing in the towel less than 5 years after offering to buy the former intrastate airlines. The indirect legacy of PSA is Southwest Airlines, originally a Texas intrastate airline that PSA inspired. Southwest inspired low-cost airlines globally. PSA therefore was a key company in the advent of low-cost air travel.
Hello, California, when you're ready to fly, we've got more planes in the sky. And when you're rushed, won't you leave it to us, 'cause we'll make your time fly. Catch us, PSA, we're saving a seat for you.
If you have any fond memories, please indicate it at the comments below. Thanks for watching, subscribe, and like.